The buzzards were already circling before Caleb Harrow ever crested that red rock ridge, and something deep in his chest told him this was the kind of sight that changes a man forever. He had ridden 3 days across the sun-scorched flats of eastern Utah Territory in the summer of 1874, his boots worn thin as paper, his last 2 coins rattling in his vest pocket like a bitter joke, and his old roan mare, Dusty, limping on a thrown shoe. He had nothing left to his name but the saddle beneath him and a stubborn refusal to lie down and quit. But what he found at the bottom of that canyon trail was something no amount of frontier hardship had ever prepared him for. The smoking wreckage of 3 wagons, bodies scattered across the red earth like broken dolls, and the kind of silence that follows when death has visited and not yet finished its work. Asterisk if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that one act of courage can change 2 lives forever. Hit that like button, leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another tale from the frontier. This one is going to stay with you. Asterisk. Caleb pulled Dusty to a halt and sat very still for a long moment, scanning every ridge and boulder with the careful eyes of a man who had survived long enough on the frontier to know that danger rarely announces itself twice. The attack had not been recent. The fires had burned down to ash and ember, but it had been savage. He counted 7 souls among the fallen, men and women both, their belongings torn open and scattered, flour and fabric and broken glass glittering under the merciless afternoon sun. Caleb had seen Apache raids and Comanche raids and the aftermath of outlaw ambushes, but something about the deliberate, organized nature of this destruction told him this was no random act of frontier violence. This had been planned by men who knew exactly what they were after. He dismounted slowly, one hand resting on the grip of his colt out of habit, and walked among the ruins with his hat in his hand, paying the dead the only respect he had left to offer. He was about to turn back to his horse when he heard it, faint as the whisper of wind through dry grass, a sound that did not belong to the dead. A single, shallow breath. Caleb spun toward the largest of the 3 overturned wagons and dropped to one knee, peering into the shadow beneath its buckled frame. There, curled behind a scorched trunk and covered in a canvas tarp that had likely saved her life, lay a young woman. She was barely conscious, her dark auburn hair matted with blood from a gash along her temple, her blue dress torn and dusty, her hands gripping the canvas, so tight her knuckles had gone white. She was alive. Barely, but alive. Easy now, Caleb said, his voice dropping to the same low, steady tone he used with frightened horses. Easy. I ain't gonna hurt you. I promise you that. He pulled the tarp back gently and got his first clear look at her. She was perhaps 22 years of age, fine-featured and pale beneath the dust and dry blood. And even in her half-conscious state, there was something composed about her, something that spoke of a life lived in far better circumstances than the one she currently found herself in. She wore a small gold cross at her throat that had somehow survived the chaos, and in her left hand, pressed against her chest like a prayer, she clutched a sealed envelope. Caleb Harrow was a man of 31 years who had known almost nothing but hard luck since the war had taken his father and the drought had taken the family's Texas cattle operation along with what remained of his youth. He had drifted from ranch to ranch across 3 territories, working for wages that barely covered beans and tobacco, sleeping under the open sky more nights than he could count, and carrying the particular loneliness of a man who had stopped expecting good things to find him. He had no money, no land, no prospects. He was, by every measure the frontier used to judge a man, a failure. And yet, as he knelt in the dust beside this unconscious woman, he never once considered riding on. That thought simply did not enter him. He gathered her up as carefully as if she were made of something precious and began the slow, careful work of keeping her alive. He used the last of his clean bandana to bind her head wound. He found an unbroken canteen beneath one of the fallen men, a kindness he accepted with a silent, guilty gratitude, and pressed it to her lips in tiny sips until she swallowed on reflex. He found enough unburned wood to build a small fire as the desert temperature began to plunge with the setting sun, and he sat beside her through the night, his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond the firelight with eyes that did not sleep. Twice in the night she stirred and whispered a name he could not make out clearly, something that sounded like father, and each time he leaned close and told her she was safe, she was not alone, and she could rest. He did not know if she heard him. He said it anyway. By morning she had developed a fever that frightened him more than any outlaw he had ever faced, because there was nothing to shoot at and no clear way to fight it. He knew there was a settlement called Red Rock Crossing some 12 miles north, a small but established frontier town with a doctor, or at least a man who claimed to be one, and a general store and a livery. He fashioned a litter from wagon boards and rope, tied it to Dusty's saddle, and began the longest 12 miles of his life, walking on foot beside his limping horse and her unconscious passenger, stopping every hour to check her breathing and wet her lips, talking to her the whole way about nothing in particular. The color of the sky, the way the hawks rode the thermals, the particular stubbornness of old Roan Mares, because silence felt like surrender, and he was not prepared to surrender. They reached Red Rock Crossing in the late afternoon, and Caleb Harrow walked straight to the doctor's door, without stopping for himself, without stopping to water Dusty properly, without doing a single thing that was not about getting this woman the care she needed. Dr. Ambrose Whitfield was a thin, serious man from Ohio who had come west after his own share of losses and had found his purpose in a place where purpose was in constant short supply. He took one look at the woman on the litter and ushered Caleb inside with the efficient authority of a man who had learned not to waste time. He cleaned the wound, set a hairline fracture in her left wrist that none of them had noticed, and announced with cautious professional confidence that she would likely survive, provided the fever broke within 48 hours. Caleb paid the doctor with the last 2 coins in his pocket, and then stood in the street outside with absolutely nothing left and felt something he had not expected to feel. Not despair, but a strange, quiet peace. Whatever came next for him, at least he had done this one thing right. She woke on the second morning, and her name, she told Dr. Whitfield first, and then Caleb when he came to sit by the door, was Margaret Alden. She was from Charleston, South Carolina, and she had come west on an arrangement made through correspondence over the course of 8 months with a rancher in Nevada named Harold Sutton, a man of considerable property and reputation who had advertised through a respectable agency for a wife of education and good character. Margaret Alden was both. She was also, as it emerged piece by piece over the following days, the only surviving daughter of one of Charleston's most prominent shipping merchants, a man named Cornelius Alden, whose wealth was substantial enough that it had apparently attracted the attention of the men who had orchestrated the Wagon Massacre. Men hired, she believed, by rivals of her father who had learned of the valuables she carried west as part of her dowry arrangement. Caleb absorbed all of this information with the careful, neutral expression of a man who has learned that the world is full of things that do not concern him. He told himself it changed nothing. He had saved a life because it was the right thing to do. What that life turned out to be was none of his business, and he would be moving on as soon as she was settled, and he had figured out how to acquire enough cash money to shoot Dusty properly and put a week's worth of food in his saddlebag. That was the plan. It was a sensible plan. He repeated it to himself several times over the course of the next few days as he found himself returning to the doctor's house every morning and evening to check on her recovery, bringing her wildflowers he picked from the creek bank because she had mentioned once, offhandedly, that she missed green things, and fixing Dr. Whitfield's porch step that had been broken since winter because it seemed like the decent thing to do. Margaret Alden, for her part, watched Caleb Harrow with the quiet, observant intelligence of a woman who had been raised to read character carefully. She saw a man who was visibly poor. His clothes told that story plainly, and visibly proud in the way that good men who have fallen on hard times carry themselves, upright and careful, never asking for anything he had not earned. She saw the way he spoke to Dusty with genuine affection. She saw the way he tipped his hat to every woman he passed in the street and stepped off the boardwalk to let others pass without making a production of the courtesy. She saw the way he talked to the town's children as though their questions deserved serious answers. She saw all of this, and she kept her own counsel, which was another thing she had been raised to do. On the fifth day, when she was well enough to sit on the porch in the afternoon light, she asked him directly what his circumstances were. Caleb took his hat off and held it in both hands and told her the truth without embellishment or self-pity, because those were the only two ways he knew how to tell anything. He told her about the ranch in Texas and the drought and the years of drifting and the fact that he was presently without meaningful employment, funds, or fixed address. He told her he had a talent for cattle work and a knowledge of the land and a willingness to work longer and harder than most men he had ever met, and that none of those things had yet translated into anything resembling a decent life. But he had not given up on the possibility that they eventually might. He said all of this to the porch rail rather than to her face, because it was easier that way. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Harrow, do you know what was in the trunk they were after?" He shook his head. "Land deeds," she said. "My father purchased 1,200 acres of Nevada grassland in my name as part of the dowry arrangement. The men who attacked us believed the deeds were in the wagons. They were not. I had them here." And she pressed her hand to the left side of her chest, where the sealed envelope rested inside her dress against her heart. The story moved fast after that, the way frontier justice tended to move when the right people got involved and the wrong people got careless. Margaret sent a wire to her father in Charleston and another to Harold Sutton in Nevada, and within 10 days Sheriff Orrin Calloway of Red Rock Crossing had received enough information from both directions to identify the men responsible for the massacre as a hired outfit working for a land speculator named Victor Crane, who had been attempting to acquire the Nevada acreage through means both legal and considerably otherwise. The arrest came in a cattle town 40 miles east, quick and unglamorous, the way real frontier justice usually was. Less gunfight and more paperwork, though there was a brief and unpleasant moment at the jail door that left one of Crane's men with a broken collarbone and Sheriff Calloway with a grudging respect for the quiet man in the worn-out boots who had happened to be standing nearby. Caleb Harrow tried to leave Red Rock Crossing 4 times over the next 2 weeks. Each time, something reasonable and unavoidable presented itself to delay his departure. The first time, Margaret's fever returned briefly and Dr. Whitfield needed someone to sit with her through the night. The second time, Dusty threw her newly shod shoe within a mile of town and he had to turn back. The third time, he got as far as the Easter trailhead before he realized he had left his bedroll at the livery and went back to retrieve it and somehow ended up helping old Jonas Pruitt load a month's worth of grain sacks at the general store because Jonas's hired boy had twisted his ankle and the work simply needed doing. The fourth time, he did not make it past the end of Main Street because Margaret Alden was sitting on the doctor's porch and she saw him and called his name and asked him please to come sit for a moment because there was something she wished to say. What she said was this: "Harold Sutton is a decent man and I intend to honor my commitment to him. But those 1,200 acres in Nevada need managing from the day I arrive, and Mr. Sutton has told me in his letters that he has been unable to find a ranch foreman he trusts. I am not a woman who offers charity, Mr. Harrow. I am a woman who recognizes ability when she sees it and believes in compensating it fairly. The position pays $40 a month, a small house on the property, full board, and a 10% share in the first year's cattle profits. I would like you to take it." She paused, and something in her careful composure softened just slightly. "I would also like you to know that I am aware of what you gave to save my life. Not just the effort, but the last of everything you had. A man like that deserves better than what the road has given him. I intend to see that he gets it, if he will allow it." Caleb Harrow held his hat in his hands for a very long time. The late afternoon sun was turning the dust of Red Rock Crossing to copper and gold, and somewhere down the street a fiddle was playing something slow and sweet, and Dusty was tied to the hitching post and watching him with a patient, knowing expression that old horses develop when they have traveled long enough with a person to understand them completely. He thought about the years of drifting. He thought about the cold mornings and the empty pockets and the way loneliness accumulates in a man like silt in a riverbed, slowly and without drama, until one day he realizes it has changed the shape of everything. He thought about the buzzards circling over that canyon rim. He thought about what it meant that he had been in exactly that place at exactly that moment with exactly nothing left to lose. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally, and his voice was steadier than he expected it to be. "I'll take it." The journey to Nevada took 3 weeks, and by the time the wagon carrying Margaret Alden and her recovered trunk of land deeds rolled onto the grassland property outside of a small town called Silver Creek, Caleb Harrow had already begun to see the land with the eyes of a man who intends to make something of it. Harold Sutton was everything Margaret's letters had suggested: a broad, quietly dignified man in his 50s who had made his ranch through decades of honest work and who welcomed his bride-to-be with a formal, respectful courtesy that contained within it the genuine possibility of warmth and partnership. He shook Caleb's hand with a firm, evaluating grip, and within 5 minutes of conversation offered him the foreman position without waiting for any further recommendation. He was that kind of man. He recognized what was real. The wedding between Margaret Alden and Harold Sutton took place in the small white church in Silver Creek on a Saturday morning in October. The hills already going gold and amber around the valley, the sky that impossible blue that only appears in the high desert in autumn. Caleb stood at the back of the church in a new shirt he had purchased with his first month's wages, the first new piece of clothing he had owned in 4 years, and watched the ceremony with a full heart and a clean conscience, which was more than he had arrived at any given place with in a very long time. There were people in that church he was beginning to know, neighbors and townspeople who had started nodding at him on the street with a particular nod that means you belong here, and that nod was worth more to him than he could have explained to anyone who had not spent years living without it. After the wedding supper, Margaret found him standing at the paddock fence watching the horses settle for the evening, and she stood beside him for a moment without speaking, the way people do when words feel insufficient. Then she said, "My father is coming out in the spring. He wants to meet the man who brought me here." She paused. "I told him there were 2 things he needed to know about you. First, that you're the finest ranch foreman in the Nevada territory. And second, that when you found me under that wagon, you spent your last 2 coins on a doctor for a woman you had never met and then walked 12 miles in the desert to make sure she was safe." She turned to look at him then, and her voice was very quiet and very certain. "The Lord puts people in each other's paths for reasons, Mr. Harrow. I have come to believe that with my whole heart." Caleb nodded slowly, watching the horses. "I believe that too," he said. "I just didn't always know it." Asterisk before we reach the end of this story, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from today and share one lesson this story gave you. Whether it's about never giving up or about how a single act of kindness can redirect an entire life. We want to read every single word you write. Asterisk. By the following spring, the Silver Creek Ranch had doubled its cattle count under Caleb's management, and Harold Sutton had given him a quiet increase in wages and a handshake that communicated more than either man needed to say aloud. A small house at the east end of the property had been repaired and furnished, and Caleb Harrow, for the first time in his adult life, had a front porch to sit on in the evenings and watch the sun go down over his own small piece of the American West. Not owned, not yet, but is in every way that mattered at the end of a long day's honest work. He wrote a letter to his mother in Texas, the first in 2 years, and told her he had found his place. He told her the world was still hard and the frontier was still unforgiving, but that kindness was real and grace was real and second chances were real, and that a man who keeps faith with his own decency, even when it costs him the last coins in his pocket, tends eventually to find himself standing somewhere worth standing. Old Dusty lived 3 more years, retired to the green pasture behind the east barn, fat and content, and followed everywhere by 2 young foals who had apparently decided she was the most interesting creature on the property. Caleb brushed her every Sunday morning without fail. He figured he owed her at least that much. And in the small white church in Silver Creek, Nevada, on a warm Sunday in the spring of 1875, Caleb Harrow sat in a pew for the first time in years and bowed his head and said thank you. Not for the job or the house or the wages or the slow, tentative return of hope, though he was grateful for all of those things. He said thank you for the buzzards circling over a red rock.